The first encounter. The winds of Tyrannus were fierce, howling across the barren cliffs that stretched toward the horizon. Commander Elias Morrow, a human soldier stranded on an alien world, stood at the edge of a jagged precipice, his gaze fixed on the twin suns dipping below the distant mountains. The orange glow bathed the planet in an eerie light, casting long shadows over the desolate landscape. For the first time in his life, Elias felt small, insignificant in the vastness of the universe. His squad had been lost days ago. The communication relay had gone down, and with it, any hope of reaching the rest of the fleet. He was alone now, the last human survivor on a world that felt too alien to belong to him. The weight of that isolation pressed on his chest, but he pushed it down, focusing on the rhythmic rise and fall of his breath. He had learned to meditate in moments like this, to silence the chaos in his mind, to remember that he had a purpose, even in the face of despair. His thoughts drifted to Earth, to the family he would never see again, to the friends he had left behind in the cold void of space. He thought of the wars that had shaped humanity, the battles that had forced them to prove themselves worthy of the stars. He thought of the fear and the pain. Then there was only silence. But that silence was shattered by a sound, faint at first, like a soft cry on the wind. Elias' sharp ears, honed by years of training, caught the sound immediately. It was a sob. Someone was in pain. He turned toward the sound, scanning the rocky terrain below him. His eyes narrowed when he saw her, a figure standing at the edge of another cliff, several hundred meters away. She was alone, her body trembling as the wind whipped around her. Her dark violet skin glowed faintly in the fading light of the suns. She was tall and slender, her long black hair flying wildly around her face as she stood motionless, her posture as rigid as the stone beneath her feet. Elias didn't need to guess. The way she was standing, the way her body seemed to lean just slightly forward, told him everything he needed to know. She was about to jump. Without thinking, Elias took off, his boots pounding the rocky surface beneath him. The sheer drop of the cliff made his heart race, but he didn't hesitate. His mind was sharp, his movements swift as he ran towards her, driven by something deeper than duty. He couldn't let her fall, not while there was still time. The wind howled in his ears, pushing against him as he ran. But the closer he got, the more he could hear. The alien woman wasn't just standing at the edge. She was crying, her sobs raw and desperate. It was a sound that resonated deep within him. He had heard that same sorrow in the voices of those he had lost, in his own voice, many years ago. When he was within a few feet of her, he stopped, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. "Hey," he called out, his voice loud enough to cut through the wind. "Don't do it." The woman froze, her head snapping around to face him. Her eyes were wide, glowing with an unnatural intensity, and for a moment, Elias thought she might strike him. But then she blinked, her expression shifting to one of confusion, followed quickly by anger. "Stay away from me, human." Her voice was sharp, but it trembled with the weight of her grief. "You don't know what it's like to live in a place like this, to lose everything." Elias stepped closer, his boots scraping against the rocky ground. He raised his hand slowly, trying to show he meant no harm. "I don't care what you think of me," he said, his voice steady. "I care about you. So don't do it." Her eyes narrowed as she stared at him, her body still swaying slightly in the wind. "You don't understand. You can't," she spat, her voice thick with emotion. "You humans, you come here with your shiny ships and your big guns. You think you can just take whatever you want and leave us to pick up the pieces. You have no idea what real suffering is." Elias swallowed hard. He had heard this before. In the heat of battle, in the aftermath of wars, in the quiet moments when people thought no one was listening. The resentment, the anger, the belief that others couldn't possibly understand. "Maybe not," Elias said quietly, his voice carrying a hint of sadness. "But I'd lost everything too, and I'm still here, still fighting, still standing." For a moment, There was nothing but the sound of the wind between them. The alien woman seemed to hesitate, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something, anything, to convince her that he wasn't just another soldier with hollow words. Elias took a step forward. "I'm not here to lecture you. I'm here to say, you don't have to do this alone. Whatever you're going through, whatever pain you're feeling, you don't have to face it by yourself." He paused, his voice softening. "We all have our battles, and we all have our breaking points, but that doesn't mean we have to end it." The woman's lip quivered, and her hands trembled as she gripped the glowing crystal in her palm, the only thing that seemed to tether her to this world. "I don't know if I can keep going," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I don't know if I have the strength." Elias stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next. The silence between them felt heavy, thick with unspoken grief. But then he spoke, his words simple but filled with quiet conviction. "Then let me help you find it," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "Please." For the first time since Elias had arrived on Tyrannus, the alien woman didn't look away. Instead, she lowered the crystal slowly, her gaze lingering on him. And for a brief, fleeting moment, Elias saw something in her eyes, a glimmer of hope. And in that moment, he knew that this encounter, this strange meeting of two very different souls, had just begun. The Zahari's pain. Kaela stepped back slightly, her trembling hands still clutching the glowing crystal to her chest. Her eyes remained locked on Elias, but her expression was unreadable, a mask of vulnerability and fear. The wind howled around them, but she could barely hear it over the raging storm inside her mind. She wanted to believe him, to accept his offer, but something inside her resisted. She had spent so long running on empty, fighting for survival on a planet that no longer had a place for her people. The idea of hope, of connection, it felt like a cruel joke. "You don't understand," she muttered under her breath, her voice shaking with emotion. "You can't possibly understand." Elias took a cautious step forward, his gaze never leaving her. He could see the pain in her eyes, feel the weight of it pressing down on her like a physical force. She was more than just an alien species to him. She was a soul, just as lost, just as broken as he was. But where he had found purpose in the fight, she had found only darkness. "I might not understand everything about you," Elias said slowly, keeping his voice calm and steady. "But I understand what it's like to feel like there's nothing left. To feel like you're fighting for something that's already been taken away." Kaela shook her head, as if trying to rid herself of the words he spoke. She glanced down at the crystal in her hands, the only thing she had left of her people, the last piece of their civilization, the final symbol of hope that had survived the Zahari's fall. But even this was tainted, a reminder of everything she had lost. Her people, once great and proud, had been broken by war, betrayed by their allies, hunted by their enemies. And now, the Zahari were a fractured race, scattered across the galaxy, clinging to their last remnants. "The Zahari were once mighty," Kaela whispered, her voice barely above the wind. "We built cities that touched the skies. We conquered worlds. We were untouchable. But now," she paused, the weight of the word hanging in the air. "Now we're nothing." Elias took another step closer, his boots crunching on the rocky ground beneath them. He had heard of the Zahari, a once dominant species, now reduced to a handful of survivors scattered across the stars. He had seen their ruins, their empty cities, heard the stories of their fall. But no matter how much he knew about them, he couldn't begin to imagine the depth of the pain she was feeling. Losing everything, your home, your people, your way of life, was something no one could truly understand unless they had experienced it. "I don't know what it feels like to lose a whole civilization," Elias admitted, his voice soft but firm. "But I know what it feels like to lose everyone I've ever loved. My family, my friends, my home. It's like you're floating in space with nothing to hold on to. You feel like you're drowning in the memories of what was, and what could have been." Kaela's eyes softened for a moment as she looked at him, her walls lowering just slightly. She had spent so long hiding her pain, hiding the broken pieces of herself from others, and yet here was this human, this soldier who had no reason to care about her or her kind, offering her something she hadn't expected: understanding. "But you're still here," Kaela said, her voice trembling with disbelief. "How? How can you still be here, after all that?" Elias smiled, though there was a sadness in his eyes. "Because I had no other choice. I couldn't give up. Not for myself. Not for them. Not for the people I'd lost. I fought because I still had something left to fight for. And even now, when everything seems impossible, I keep going because I believe there's still something worth living for." Her gaze dropped to the ground as she absorbed his words. They were simple, almost painfully so. But there was truth in them. She had heard about humans, about how they had fought against overwhelming odds, how they had survived when others had fallen. The stories she had heard always painted them as warriors, driven by sheer will and an unshakable belief in their cause. But she had never understood it, never believed that such strength could exist. "And what do you think is worth living for?" Kaela asked quietly, her voice softer than before. The rawness in her words was unmistakable, a desperate search for meaning in the chaos around her. Elias took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on hers. "The future. The possibility that something better is out there. That if we hold on long enough, if we keep fighting, we can rebuild. We can find hope again, even when it feels impossible." Kaela stood still, her eyes searching his face for a flicker of insincerity, but finding none. She had lived in the shadow of loss for so long, it was difficult to imagine a future where hope could exist again. But something in Elias's words stirred something inside her, something that hadn't been touched in years. "You speak of hope," Kaela said, her voice almost a whisper. "But what if hope is a lie? What if we're just clinging to a dream that will never come true?" Elias's eyes softened. "Then maybe the lie is worth believing in," he said quietly. "Because without it, we have nothing left." Kaela looked away, staring out at the expanse of Tyrannus's landscape, the horizon stretching endlessly before her. The wind picked up again, but this time it felt different, less like an adversary, and more like a reminder that she was still alive, still breathing. She didn't know if she could find hope again. She didn't know if she could keep fighting. But for the first time in years, she felt like there was a chance, a sliver of light in the darkness. "I don't know if I can do this," Kaela murmured, her voice barely audible. Elias took a small step forward, his presence steady and unwavering. "Then let me help you," he said simply. "We'll take it one step at a time. Together." For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, the weight of their shared pain hanging in the air. But in that silence, there was something else, a quiet promise, an unspoken understanding. And in that moment, Kaela allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still a reason to keep going. Human resilience. The silence between them lingered, but it was no longer oppressive. The wind seemed to soften, as if it too was waiting for Kaela to speak, to make a choice. Elias stood beside her, not pressing, but offering his presence. He didn't need her to decide right away. He knew that healing, whether from loss or despair, wasn't a quick fix. It was something that took time. And sometimes, the first step was simply letting someone else stand by you in the dark. Kaela's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, her gaze distant. The image of her people, their once glorious cities, their soaring ships, their proud warriors, flashed through her mind like ghosts of a past that no longer existed. She wanted to believe Elias. She wanted to believe that hope could be more than just a fleeting, broken thing. But how could she? How could she believe in something so fragile when the world she knew had crumbled to dust? "I've been running for so long," Kaela finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Running from what's left of my people. Running from the memories, the pain. I thought that if I kept moving, I wouldn't have to face it. But it's always there, waiting." Elias nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. "I get it. I really do. When everything is lost, the world feels like a cage, and the only way out seems like giving up. He paused, his gaze distant for a moment, as if recalling his own struggles. I felt that way too, after I lost my family. I thought maybe I could just shut it all out, leave it behind, and move forward. But the thing is, you can't outrun grief. You can't outrun pain. Kaela turned to him, her eyes wide with curiosity. She had heard humans speak of loss, but Elias spoke of it with a weight she had never expected. He wasn't just saying words for the sake of comforting her. He was speaking from a place of deep understanding, of experience. "But you kept going," she said, her voice a mixture of disbelief and awe. "You didn't stop." Elias gave a small, rueful smile. "Some days I wanted to. Other days it felt like I had no choice. I just kept moving because I had to. Because the alternative was worse. When you lose everything, you find that the only thing you can control is whether or not you keep fighting." He turned to look at her fully, his brown eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "And that's what makes humans different, Kaela. We don't stop. No matter how bad it gets, we keep fighting for something, anything. We fight for each other. We fight for ourselves. And we never, ever stop looking for a reason to keep going." Kaela swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle deep in her chest. She had heard stories of humanity's relentless perseverance, their refusal to accept defeat. She had admired their bravery from a distance, thinking it was just another trait to be observed from afar. But now, standing beside him, hearing the raw truth in his voice, it felt more real than anything she had ever known. "You really believe that?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "I do," Elias said, his tone firm yet gentle. "Because when you lose everything, when you're down to nothing, you realize something powerful. You realize that the things you thought were important, the things you thought defined you, aren't what you need to survive. What you need is a reason to live. You need a reason to hope, to fight, even if it's just for one more day. And sometimes that reason is as simple as someone standing by your side, telling you that you're not alone." Kaela's breath caught in her throat as she looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent so long thinking she was beyond saving, beyond redemption. But here, in the presence of this human soldier who had nothing to gain from helping her, she felt something stir inside her, a flicker of the hope that had long since been extinguished. "Is that what you believe? That we're never truly alone?" Kaela asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah, I do. There's always someone out there who understands. Even when you think you're invisible, even when you think you've lost everything, there's always a way back. You just have to find the strength to take the first step." Kaela closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words wash over her. For the first time in years, the pain she had carried so heavily in her chest felt a little lighter, a little less suffocating. It didn't mean everything would be okay. It didn't mean the world was suddenly perfect, or that all her problems would vanish. But in that moment, standing next to Elias, she realized something. She wasn't alone. "I don't know how to do this," Kaela confessed, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to stop feeling like everything is slipping through my fingers." Elias gave her a reassuring smile, his expression kind but resolute. "One step at a time. That's all you need to do. One step. And when you're ready, we'll face tomorrow together." For a long moment, Kaela didn't speak. She simply stood there, looking out at the barren land stretching before her. The wind was no longer a force to be feared. It felt like a quiet companion, one that whispered of change, of possibility. "I think." Kaela hesitated, unsure of the words. But something within her urged her to speak. "I think I'm ready to take that first step." Elias's smile widened, a sense of relief washing over him. He had seen so many people break under the weight of their grief, so many soldiers fall in the heat of battle, their spirits crushed by the losses they had endured. But Kaela, she wasn't like the others. She had a fire in her, a strength she didn't even realize she possessed. And for the first time since he had arrived on Tyrannus, Elias believed that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for her, for both of them. "Good," he said quietly. "We'll take it slow, but we'll take it together." And for the first time since he had stepped foot on this alien world, Elias felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The power of connection. The night settled in over Tyrannus like a dark, comforting blanket, the twin moons rising in the sky to cast a pale glow over the desolate landscape. The wind had died down, leaving behind a quiet calm, the kind of silence that made everything feel more intimate, more real. Elias and Kaela had found a small alcove at the base of the cliff, a shelter from the harsh environment. They had built a fire from the few supplies Elias had left, and though it wasn't much, it was enough. For the first time in days, perhaps weeks, Kaela felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Peace. She sat on a large stone, staring into the flickering flames, her violet skin glowing softly in the firelight. Elias sat across from her, his expression thoughtful as he poked at the fire with a long stick. The quiet between them wasn't awkward, but rather, it was a comfortable space, one that allowed them both to breathe, to process what had happened and what was still to come. Elias had shared a little about himself, about Earth and the battles he had fought in. But now it was Kaela's turn to speak. She wasn't sure why she felt the need to share her story now. Maybe it was the quiet assurance in Elias's eyes, or the calm that had settled over her in his presence, but something inside her urged her to finally open up, to let go of the weight she had been carrying for so long. "I never wanted to be a warrior," Kaela said softly, her voice almost lost in the sound of the crackling fire. "I never wanted to fight. My people, we were scholars, explorers, artists. We sought knowledge, beauty, and peace, but when the war came, we had no choice. We had to fight, had to defend what was ours." Elias looked at her, his gaze steady and understanding. "I don't think anyone ever really chooses war," he said quietly. "It's something that's thrust upon you, something you fight against, not for." Kaela nodded slowly, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the crystal she had been holding earlier. "The worst part wasn't the battles," she continued. "It was the aftermath. Watching everything we built crumble. Watching our cities burn, our people scatter, our culture disintegrate. It's like we became ghosts, wandering in a world that doesn't remember us. And the worst part was that I couldn't save them. My people. I couldn't protect them." Elias felt a deep ache in his chest. He had lost people too many to count. But this was something different. Kaela wasn't just grieving loss. She was grieving her entire existence, the very essence of who she was. And that was a weight so much heavier than he could have imagined. "You didn't fail them," Elias said softly, leaning forward. "You did everything you could. But sometimes things are beyond our control. Sometimes we can't save the ones we love. But that doesn't mean we stop trying. It doesn't mean their sacrifice is in vain. You still have a chance to rebuild, to honor them." Kaela's eyes flickered toward him, a mixture of disbelief and something softer, something vulnerable. She had never heard anyone speak to her like that, so simply, so truthfully. It was as though he understood her pain in a way no one else had, as if he saw her for who she truly was, not just the broken survivor of a fallen people. "I don't know how to rebuild," Kaela whispered, the words heavy on her tongue. "I don't know how to start over. Everything I've known is gone." Elias smiled, though there was a sadness to it. "Start with what you have," he said gently. "Start with the people around you. The ones who still have hope, who still believe that something better is possible. Sometimes that's all you need. The willingness to stand with others, to fight together. If we learn anything from our losses, it's that we're stronger together. We can rebuild not just our worlds, but ourselves." Kaela met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that made her believe he wasn't just offering empty words. He was offering the truth. He was offering his belief in her, in the possibility that no matter how broken the world seemed, there was still a chance to create something new, something meaningful. She sat in silence for a moment, the warmth of the fire radiating against her skin. The crackling of the flames seemed to echo her thoughts, each flicker of light reminding her that there was still warmth, still life, still potential in this world. She had almost forgotten that. The darkness had consumed her for so long that she couldn't remember what it felt like to hope. "Maybe I've been wrong," Kaela said softly, looking down at the crystal again. "Maybe there's more to life than just surviving. Maybe I've been too focused on the past, too focused on what we lost, instead of what we still have." Elias nodded. "That's the hardest part," he agreed. "Letting go of the past so we can move forward. It's not easy, but it's the only way to find peace, to find a reason to keep going." Kaela's lips quivered slightly, but this time it wasn't from the sorrow she had carried for so long. This time, it was from the spark of something else, a new understanding, a new resolve. She looked at Elias, her eyes bright with something she hadn't felt in a long time. "Hope, I think," she said slowly, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I think I want to try. I want to see what it feels like to fight for something again. To believe that maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to rebuild, not just our worlds, but ourselves." Elias smiled, his heart swelling with pride for the strength he saw in her. "That's the spirit," he said quietly. "You're not alone, Kaela. Not anymore. We'll face the future together." The fire crackled between them, a symbol of the warmth they had begun to share, of the new journey they would take together. The road ahead would be long, filled with challenges and uncertainties, but for the first time, Kaela didn't feel afraid. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't facing it alone. And that, she realized, was everything. A new beginning. The days on Tyrannus passed slowly, but for Elias and Kaela, the time felt different now. It was no longer just a countdown to an inevitable end. Every moment they spent together, each conversation, each shared silence, was a step forward, a chance to rebuild not only their broken worlds but their very selves. They had gathered what supplies they could, scouring the nearby area for anything useful. Elias, ever the soldier, knew how to make the most of what they had, but it was Kaela who helped him see things differently. The Zahari had once been explorers, creators of advanced technology and builders of beautiful cities. Even in the midst of their fall, she still carried the knowledge, the wisdom, of a culture that had once thrived. It was this knowledge that began to shine through as they worked together, finding ways to repair old systems, patching up the communication array that had been damaged during the war. They had no illusions that they could fix everything overnight, but each small success, each piece of progress, gave them both hope. One evening, as the two sat by the fire, Kaela held up a small device she had been working on, her fingers moving delicately over the components as she explained how it functioned. Elias watched her, his heart swelling with admiration. There was a spark in her eyes now, something alive and determined that he hadn't seen before. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, truly living, and it was because of the small moments they shared, the quiet bonds that had begun to form between them. "I can't believe it," Kaela said, her voice filled with a quiet excitement. "This old thing still works. It's a Zahari data uplink. It was used to connect our people across the stars, to share knowledge, to maintain communication with the core worlds. And now, we can use it. We can reach out." Elias smiled at her, his eyes full of pride. "I knew you still had it in you," he said, his voice warm. "You're not just a survivor, Kaela. You're a builder, a creator." Kaela looked down at the device in her hands, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe," she said slowly, her voice filled with a mixture of uncertainty and newfound confidence. "Maybe it's not about rebuilding everything we lost. Maybe it's about starting something new, something we can both believe in, a new kind of future." Elias nodded, the firelight dancing in his eyes as he spoke, his voice soft, but filled with conviction. "You're right. We can't go back. But we can move forward. Together." Kaela met his gaze, her heart pounding as she realized the truth in his words. She had spent so long living in the past, in the ruins of what had been, that she had never considered the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by loss, but by something more, by hope, by connection, and by the unyielding strength of the human spirit. And in Elias, she saw the promise of that future. She saw someone who refused to let go of the belief that no matter how dark the road ahead seemed, they could face it together. They spent the next few weeks building, repairing, and sharing stories of their pasts. Kaela telling Elias about the Zahari's great history and culture, while Elias spoke of Earth and the trials his people had overcome. Slowly, they built a connection that transcended species, a bond forged in the fires of hardship and pain. They no longer viewed each other as human and alien. They were simply two people, two souls, who had found a reason to fight for something greater than themselves. One day, as they stood on the cliffside overlooking the vast expanse of Tyrannus, Kaela turned to Elias, her eyes bright with determination. The sun was setting in the distance, casting a golden light over the barren planet, but Kaela saw it differently now. She saw potential. She saw possibility. She saw a future. "I don't know what will happen next," she said, her voice steady, "but I know one thing for sure. We're not alone anymore. We have each other." Elias smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "And we always will." Kaela took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the planet beneath her feet, the wind in her hair, and the fire of resolve burning in her chest. This wasn't just a new beginning for her. It was a new beginning for both of them. Together, they would build something new, something stronger than what had come before. And though the path ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: no matter the obstacles, no matter the darkness, they would face it together. Because in the end, it wasn't the past that defined them. It was their will to fight for the future. And that, they knew, was worth everything.